Welcome to One Weighted Machines and the B7 Audi RS4 series. As you can see, the garbage can that was in the garage is now outside of the house, and this is to reduce the fumes from all the brake cleaner still being all in the atmosphere of the garage. So take your garbage can outside when you're not using it. When it comes to torque wrenches, I went back and did some research for you guys because I bought this one a long time ago, and the place that I bought it from does not make them in 5 to 80 foot-pounds anymore, and most of the stuff that I saw online now was between 20 to 100 foot-pounds. I think there was one brand, Cobalt, it has a 5 to 100 foot-pounds, so I'd recommend that. But torque wrenches range greatly in price, so I don't think you need too expensive one. I can't remember exactly how much I paid for this, but the important part is, especially if you're doing a job like this, you want something that starts from 5 or below if you can find it. And if it goes up to 80, 100, that's better because then you can use it for a bigger range of projects. But try to avoid the ones that start from 20 because most of the torque specs in this job are lower than that. I just want to clarify this because I don't know what I said in the previous video, or this is just another general thing to repeat, which is good for you guys, is that the connectors I was talking about, there's the evap connector and there's the low pressure fuel connector. The one that I got stuck under the manifold when I was reinstalling was this one. Okay, this is the one that was in sight, so I might have been talking about this one. But this one you wanted to bring out on the back side of the oil filter housing. This is going to plug into your evap purge. And the low pressure fuel line one is the one that you don't want snagged underneath the intake manifold when you go to put it in. So make sure this is coming out of the top and you have wiggle room. I mean, you got a video to go with, so this is where you want it to be coming out from so that it can plug in to the connector. Because if it goes in here, it's going to get pinched, you might damage it, it might get damaged when you're driving, and you will not be able to access this connector here. So very important that this one is back here. So gray for fuel, black for evap. Once you've dropped in your 10 manifold bolts, you don't want to tighten them down. If you tighten them down with your ratchet first, coming back with your torque wrench is pretty much useless. You're just going to know if you got it up to 6.6 foot-pounds. You want to just barely tighten them, holding this in your hand, and then come back with the torque wrench and use it as a ratchet a little bit, and then get your torque spec so that you know you have even torque. If you tighten them with the ratchet and you come back with the torque wrench, yeah, you'll know if you got to 6.6 foot-pounds, but some of them may be torqued higher than others, and you don't want that. You want it to be even across the board. So once we come in with our torque wrench, we're going to go 1, 2, so the two middle ones, and then we're going to go in a general star pattern out from the middle and torque all of the bolts. So in terms of torquing, one other thing that I would suggest is, I had to do some edits to make it go a bit quicker, but say if you do 1 and 2 at the beginning, tighten them slightly with the torque wrench, go to the other one, tighten it slightly, go back and forth between 2 until you get a click and a click from the torque wrench. Say you move on now to these two for your next set. Tighten this one down, tighten this one a bit more, a bit more, a bit more. By the time you come back, click, click. Same thing. Work on 2 sets at the same time. Don't completely tighten one down and click it down and then come here and completely tighten the other one. Work in pairs when you're doing this. Next, we're going to put in the 3 bolts for the PCV box. I mentioned this in the previous part, but make sure your vacuum line is now underneath so that you can get your hand under there. Be gentle with it. It's still working with very tight clearances there, but don't plug your vacuum line back in yet. We need all of this stuff out to access that bottom bolt. Then we'll come back and do the electrical connectors. So just hand tight the 3 Torx bolts that go for the PCV box now. Take great care not to drop the bolts when you're working back here. Be focused at this stage. Once you've threaded them in by hand, use this mini wrench that you have to tighten the bolts. No torque spec on this, just get them nice and tight. The one thing when I was threading in the most bottom bolt that I can give you as a tip is to come over towards the passenger headlight, have your knees resting there, and go in using your both index fingers. So obviously you put it in with your, like this, but then use your index fingers in this orientation like this to grab the sides of the bolts and slowly thread it in. That works a lot better in terms of controlling the actual movement of the bolt, and you have more fingers there to catch it if it tries to fall, but it won't once you're in there enough. So do that and you'll be able to thread it more easily than getting your whole hand back there. And also doing it this way is less of the meat bulk of your hand back there, which means less pressure possibly on that vacuum line to break it. That bottom bolt on the PCV box is worth talking about for hours because it's one of the worst parts of this job. And now that I'm putting it back and I'm paying attention making the video, other things I'm going to mention is when you're leaned over there and you get your hand back here, okay, again, this flimsy coolant line becomes another piece that can possibly break, okay, because you're going to be back there and by the time you get your hand here, your forearm is going to want to press against the firewall, and guess what's here? You've got vacuum line, fuel line, coolant line, and you can put a lot of pressure on them. So be careful when you go there. You have to mind this, you have to mind the vacuum line, and when you're in there, make sure that you've threaded that bottom bolt the whole way with your fingers. Okay, because if you get this little wrench in there and you start going at it and it's not going, you're going to get frustrated, you're going to push back, you're going to push forward. There's more chance for damage. So thread that the whole way in and then get in there and do a good 3-4 turns with this and get it tight. Be careful and finish that off. With the throttle body still out of the car, you have more flexibility with this vacuum line that goes underneath. So you want to bring it forward again, gently minding everything. And now we're going to go to the back. We're going to clip back our vacuum hoses. The one thing I would recommend you do first is clip back the 2 ends of the vacuum hose contraption. That's what I've called it throughout the series, so we'll call it like that to the end. Clip both of those in and then bring in the small black Torx bolt and do the final bolt that goes in that bracket back here that I showed in a different part of the series. The point of that is that you require more flexibility to move these around and you don't want to make this rigid before that. So plug them in first and then put in the bolt. The last time I put in this vacuum line contraption, it was much easier. This time my camera showed that it took me 10 minutes of aggravation. While you have to be very careful and delicate, you also have to have enough force to make sure the squeeze tabs get in. Now, when you're doing this, make sure you don't put in the screw first. And when you're putting the clips, put the passenger side one in first and then go over to the driver's side one, because that one has a bit of more of an accordion on the vacuum line and you can ever so gently flex it just a little bit to clip it onto that vacuum pump or whatever that thing is down there. You got to be really careful back here. Like I said, last time I remember it being a breeze. That's what working on this car is like. Sometimes something will take you 30 seconds and then the next time you come around it'll take you 10 minutes to do it. But don't force anything. Be gentle with it and you will get it. So put in the passenger side one in first, then go back there and just very gently move the other one around until you can clip it in. And when you are going to clip the second one in, don't try to use your finger too much to force it into its hole. Bring it back as soon as you get it past the line where you can get it. You see that it's going to go into the vacuum line hose. Visibility is very limited over there. Come back over here to the Y part of the vacuum line contraption. You can't see it anymore, it's way down there. But in previous parts of the video, you will see it, that there's a metal part and then there's plastic lines. You want to grab it with your left hand from the metal part and then slowly give it split force. Give half your force from here with your left hand, and with your right hand, I have a camera in my way so I'm not optimally positioned in front of the car to put force in it. You guys need to be able to see, but I should be standing directly in front of the car when I'm doing this. So left hand here, and then with your right hand and your vision looking in there, you guide that one, you give it some push with each hand, and then you'll be able to get the click to go in. So passenger side clicks first, driver side clicks second. Be very careful on this step. Next, we're going to put in the one screw that holds the vacuum line contraption to bank 2. This is another one of those bolts to be really careful that you don't drop. This stake isn't as intense as the bolt on the bottom of the PCV box, but now that you do have this tool, use it. You could probably do that with the standard ratchet I probably did last time, but this just makes it a lot easier to use for the T30. The other thing I would say when you're reinstalling that bolt is hand space again is very tight back there, and the back of your right hand is going to have a tendency to press up again against that brittle plastic vacuum line contraption which you are fastening, so you don't want to break that. Again, take great care in there not to break that line while you're tightening that bolt. Same thing with the bottom PCV box bolt. Get in there, make sure you do as much of it as you can by hand, and then get in there for 3 to 4 turns with this one. Next, we're going to plug in some electrical connectors. I think this is a cam sensor, don't quote me on that, but whatever it is, you need to plug this one back in. We're going to plug the coil packs back and the vacuum actuator connector that you tucked into the front when you were cleaning, and the manifold flap runner sensor. Once you get them out, you want to plug these two back in. We're also going to plug back in the other sensor for the manifold flap runner sensor bank 1. And the most important thing with your electrical connectors is hear audible clicks so that you know that they're in. The same with those vacuum lines we did at the back. Do your best. There's a lot going on, but you need to hear that these things click so that you don't have warning lights on the dash and you have to come back after you finish this job. In terms of the two connectors at the front of the manifold here, one of them is a 3-prong. The manifold runner one is a 3-prong. The vacuum actuator one is a 2-prong, so you can't mix them up. When I came to take out that vacuum line last time, as you'll remember in the other parts, we disassembled a whole bunch of brackets along the coil packs and here, just so that we could get our hand back there. I might be wrong, but I remember the first time I might have been able to get my hand in there somehow without disassembling all this stuff. This time it was necessary, and a lot of people do this slight coil pack unplugging and other wires. What's happened to me now though, because I want to go over everything that happens in the job in case you guys run into odd things. These coil packs, I plugged them all back in right now, and generally this is a very easy task on any of these cars. So the first 3, they plugged in nicely, and then the 4th one wouldn't go in. So I disassembled them again. I tried from the back, coming back in. I tried it many times. I've been going at it for about 5 to 10 minutes, putting the maximum amount of pressure that I can without breaking these plastic covers to try to get all 4 coil packs to seat. Now whether the tab is worn out on the coil pack side, or if the clip is worn out, I don't know which one it is. But with the gentlest of care that I could, only 3 of them clipped in. This last one, it'll be held in by these 2 bolts that hold in this whole bracket. It'll give us a misfire code if this coil pack is not connecting. But no, I put my entire body force on this before it would break. And this still has a little bit of play in it, and the tab is not connecting for some reason. So old cars. Things can happen, and these components are not anything we want to replace, so I'm just going to put the screws back. I tried it at least 10 times, which is more than I should try it, and we're going to see if it gives us a misfire code, but that's what happened here. Put back 2 small T20 self tappers that hold in coil pack bracket. Next, we're going to put the eyelet that we removed from the front driver's side rear back in. Remember, they're 2 different size T50s. You should have stored them properly. You want to make sure to put those in before the wiring bracket little metal tabs, because these will be in the way when you come to install this. So do the eyelet first and then the metal brackets. The metal brackets, the one with the side tab goes at the back, and the one with the straight tab goes at the front. Pretty much the whole point is you want to orient them. You can't mix them up to both be pointing downwards. You want the hole to be pointing towards the ground. The torque for the eyelet bolts is 16 foot-pounds or 22 Newton meters, and for the small brackets it is 9 Newton meters or 6.6 pound-feet. Plug these plastic guide tabs back into the metal eye holes that you just installed, and reconnect this electrical connector here on the driver's side bank. The high pressure fuel sensor is the only thing at this point that's going to be released. Actually, let me go back on that. Do all of this stuff after you put in the T50 for the front eyelet that we removed. At this point, go ahead and do this one and that one, and then do this step. I might have forgotten to mention that for removal and reinstall of the coil packs on the driver's side bank, removing the dipstick makes it a little bit easier, puts less pressure on this, gives you more room for your hands too. So that's why the oil dipstick was removed. And the torque spec for this front eyelet and the rear one with the T50s is the same as the back one, 16 pound-feet. Now we're going to come to the firewall side again. What we're going to do is connect our, I'll keep calling it the flimsy coolant line, into the bypass line that we have now made. So push this in there, use needle nose pliers to pull the clamp up. At the same time, or before that probably, you want to slide this piece back and plug this vacuum line back in. This one didn't have a clamp or anything. You just simply push it back in. Again, be very gentle with everything back here. So put those 2 back. Our next item is this fuel clip, which holds the 2 fuel lines associated to the injectors to the intake manifold. So these do come apart for easier reinstall. You just crack it open, slide it around, and then using the T30 bolt that you stored over there, you're going to thread it in by hand again, and then just tighten it with that small wrench that you have. This is another one of those bolts you have to be careful not to drop. Okay, so we're going to stop here. This fuel clip can get the most patient of you, okay? My magnet has a claw grabbing mechanism at the bottom that I was able to get in the hole because I dropped that side. My magnet, whether it's too dirty or this was too dirty, it wasn't picking it up. But this fuel clip, I mean, if you can leave it on, leave it on. Eventually, after a few times I put the manifold back on and off when I took breaks for the filming and editing, it just loosened up and fell, and I took it off and I set it aside. But if you do end up taking that fuel clip off, you gotta have a lot of patience when you go to put it back. So it ended up being off camera, but I did get the fuel clip on. It went in the orientation it looks like it should. And all that it took was, I was being too gentle with the fuel lines again. You need to be a little bit more harsh with them. You can move them. There is some room for play. And you ought to put it around the smaller one first from the back. And then tug this one just a tad bit forward and clip the fuel clip back together. It'll require a bit of force, more than you'd think. But by then you can align this and get the one bolt in. So again, what I said just before this, one time it's going to skip your mind as to how much pressure you can put in a certain place. Last time I didn't even think about this. It just went right back on. This time it took me 15 minutes. So don't get mad if something takes longer than it did the first time that you did it. The torque spec for the fuel distributor bolts to the intake manifold is 25 Newton meters or 18 foot-pounds. Remember that these two bolts are different sizes, so it's important to store them with the fuel distributor. When you go in, you really can't mix it up. It goes in this way here. And these are the two bolts that you're going to torque to 25 Newton meters. In order to add to the complexity of this engine here, there are many of these small fuel clips everywhere. I haven't fastened this down. I've just put this here so that I can show you guys. But there is one more fuel clip that I left underneath there. So when I took this one off, another one of them slid down when I wasn't paying attention, and it's underneath the intake manifold, but it is visible. The only thing that that one does is with this T30, it holds it to one of these injector fuel lines here to give it a bit more stability. This is going to have more than enough stability with these two bolts. The other side does not have any such support bracket, so that's another sign that this is something we can get away with. Not something I recommend you do. But these fuel lines also, there are JHM intake spacers. I don't have them on this car, but other people that have installed them say that you even have to bend some of the fuel system components in order to make that stuff fit. This stuff is a lot more durable. This is more of just an overly fail-safe fuel clip. This last one that just holds this part of the rail to one of these lines. So I'm not going to go all the way back and remove the manifold right now. I'm going to finish this video. But we are going to be back in here to do a lot more work on this motor and give you guys a lot more tutorials. So I just wanted to say that paying attention to almost every small thing, you have a lower chance of dropping that down there, because I have to go edit videos in between this. You'll probably do this whole job in a weekend or 2 or 3 days, and most of this stuff will stay in its place. You're not going to be putting this manifold back on and off 7 or 8 times to prevent things from falling in. But that is not something that I'm putting back right now. So just to give you guys an idea of how attentive you have to be in this area for all of the fuel clips that are associated with this motor. This fuel clip that I speak of, which goes on here, is also not just sitting in the valley. If it was sitting, I would definitely not leave it. I would have taken it out. It is clamped around one of these fuel lines very tightly, so I can access it with my hand. I know that there's nothing wrong, and it will be there when we come back to do this. Pretty sure I mentioned it, but I got carried away with the fuel clip. So these two were 25 Newton meters or 18 foot-pounds, same thing. Just get them just a little bit tight with your socket, and then use a torque wrench between the two to get them to their final torque. After these two are torqued down, you can plug in your fuel electrical connector, and then we'll go grab our high pressure fuel pumps. Oh God. A quite joyous event has occurred. My intuition was to only use the torque specs on the intake manifold because it can get vacuum leaks, and on the throttle body because it can get vacuum leaks. Everything else last time I did them just hand tight. This time, because I'm doing a video, I used the repair manuals with their torque specs for everything, and I've been telling you guys all the torque specs as we've been going along. Now, this is Frustrating, but these things happen. If I would have hand tight these two bolts, we would have just continued on nicely right now. But the repair manuals have it listed as fuel distributor to intake manifold, 25 Newton meters. And that's what I've set it at, 18 foot-pounds, which is the equivalent to 25 Newton meters. And these two bolts, this has to do probably with some planned obsolescence stuff with this car, that the different bolts are different materials and some of them are rusted and some of them are not. These two are the two rustiest bolts in the entire car, and they're on top of the car, which does not make much sense. But that also goes to show that maybe these are a different metal mix, maybe these are weaker bolts that they used up here. The one at the back, torqued down nice and perfectly fine. This is in here and it's tight, 18 foot-pounds. This brilliant bolt here, of course, had to snap when I went to take it to 18 foot-pounds. So this manifold has been off a number of times before, and there have been no problems when I've gone hand tight. So you know what? Go with what I said before. The bolts that aren't so important for vacuum leaks, just get them nice and hand tight. It's an old car, things can break, and manufacturers make different bolts in different parts of the cars with different materials to save cost. And here's a perfect example of one. This thing snapped on me when I went to put it to factory torque spec. So, brilliant. At a later time, I'm going to have to take this all off again, and I'm going to have to drill into the manifold and pull that broken bolt out. But for the purposes of those of you that are doing this job, I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of the reinstall. Another issue I didn't have last time that now I have. This fuel connector will go just far enough to jump in there. This one is miles away from its port, so that fuel clip that we put on does not seem like it could possibly go on in any other orientation, but I'm going to remove it and see how much more space we really have to move this fuel line back into here. The intake manifold is on perfectly, spot on. There's nothing else that could be causing this large discrepancy here. I've never had this before. Let's see what it is. So the first step to troubleshoot this is we're going to remove again that bolt for the fuel clip that we had trouble with earlier from the intake manifold to see how much play there really is to get this back. I do remember last time that these two fuel lines did need a bit of force to get into their respective holes. I don't know if it's because I have to work on odd angles for the camera or if something is different this time, but this top one is going in very nicely and smoothly. I've been poking around at this smaller one for about 5 minutes now, trying to get it to align before I put the banjo bolt back on. So everything under the manifold is free and clear. The fuel clip is off. These lines have their maximum flexibility. So these are places that you may have a bit of a struggle. Just be gentle and don't do too much heavy pushing, but have a feel for it. This isn't a basic wrenching job, this whole project. Okay guys, so after about 15 to 20 minutes on camera, there's a lot of swearing and trying to get this fuel line and the banjo bolt to go on, I decided to turn the camera off because I had to really get in there and I was covering the whole thing, and at that point I was able to be gentle yet harsh enough to hold this line in the proper place in order to hand tighten this so I didn't cross thread it onto this fuel block here. There is nothing snagging anything under the intake manifold. The fuel block is also in its proper position even though we broke one bolt. This is exactly where it goes. Last time I did remember having to use some force to get these into their space. Other more experienced people that have done this too, they have also said that you do have to give these some force to put them into space. But now that I got this on and that on, to go put this fuel clip back on, it's going to be very difficult to do. So if I have enough patience, I might do it. If not, I'm going to be like the injector guy and leave this for the next job. So I'm going through everything that's happening with you guys. I'm not trying to hide anything. So there you have it. Okay guys, so we're back here and let's go over what happened with this bolt that snapped. This was torqued to the correct spec, and I just want to go over this bolt to compare it to other ones. For example, for the intake manifold bolts, there's not a speck of rust either on the head or the actual threaded portion of the bolt. These bolts, this is just so that the rest of you don't use torque specs on these, just do them hand tight. They only have rust around the top of them. But the actual part that is threaded on both bolts is free of any rust. So these bolts must be of some kind of a different metal, or it was just a freak event that this one broke on me. But if I could go back, obviously we'll have to drill this out of the intake manifold at some point. The other bolt is holding this in at elephant strength, so there's no point to do that right now, but we will be taking the manifold off again, so we will drill that piece out of the manifold. But I just want to say that a lot of your cars might be lower mileage than mine, and even if you don't have the rust on the top of the bolt, don't be fooled to think that, oh, your bolt might be fine to torque to 18 foot-pounds. It most likely is not. Just do it hand tight, you'll be fine. Last time I was fine. The only bolts that I would say after this experience that you should do by the repair manual is the intake manifold bolts. Do tighten them to 6.6 foot-pounds or 9 Newton meters, what's recommended, as those are not going to be easy bolts to check after the fact. So if you drive the car for say 50, 100 kilometers and you come back to see if any bolts have possibly backed out that you've hand tightened, this stuff on the top and even the throttle body, I'm not going to do it by the torque specs. I'm just going to do it hand tight. These are easier places for you to come back and do a quick check, okay, what's tight, what's not. The intake manifold, the 10 bolts, you have to disassemble everything to get to most of them. So you may as well do those by the torque specs. They're quite low torque specs. This one, I'm still kind of angry at myself for even following what the repair manual said, because I could almost feel that it was too much torque. But these things happen and we have to deal with it. Fortunately, it's on there tight enough. Let's just hope the next time we take it off, the other one isn't in there so tight that it breaks. But we'll see what happens. So that's for that. The next topic is a funny one, because I'm going to try to leave in as much of the mistakes that I continued to make because of things that I didn't remember, just in case you guys could use the same troubleshooting if it happens to you. You're probably best off just taking pictures of this stuff and you won't have to run into any of this. But for those of you that don't, like me, when it comes to the fuel clips, okay, many times I mentioned this fuel clip, the one with the metal around it and the odd shape that has the one bolt that goes into the intake manifold, that it bolts onto the actual fuel lines. Thinking like this, because it looks like it could do it, and I actually did get this in place in order to get it on there. But then when I put this fuel clip incorrectly on these two lines at the bottom, this second one had a very hard time getting to the banjo bolt fitting. You are going to have to use a bit of force on these anyways. I had to do it last time, I had to do it this time, but this made it impossible, okay, because I put this in the wrong place. This one is actually one of the first ones you take off, and it goes here. It goes onto this bolt on this bracket here. You should take it off, leave it on. Most likely, like I said, a lot of them are going to get loose and you take them off. This bolt is not associated to this one, the one with the metal around it. The one that this bolt goes in is a fuel clip that only goes around the large one, okay? And you can distinguish it from the other fuel clips because it has this black rubber material on the outside, and it only has one hole for one of the fuel lines, and that's most likely going to stay on. It'll be very difficult to get that one off. You can get it off, but you have to gently bring it up, and that's the one that the T30 goes into the intake manifold for, not this one. This one goes on top, it goes over here. So don't mix those up. I'm going to reinstall them properly now, but like I said, I mean, I will leave some of it in and not edit it out so that you guys can see where my thinking went wrong, and maybe that'll help some of you. But take pictures and avoid the whole thing, okay? Reinstall two fuel clips in their correct positions. Replace high pressure fuel pump on driver side and passenger side, and refit banjo bolts. I'm not going to give you guys torque specs because they were higher, or brake bolts, so just hand tight and come back after 100 kilometers and monitor them. Last time I did it, it was fine. So that's the next step. So again, a problem that I didn't have last time. Last time I was able to put the high pressure pump back in, gently put the lines back into their holes, just a slight bit of force, and then redo the banjo bolts. This time, the smaller line went in fine. The larger line, I've been putting the maximum pressure that you can put on it, and it's not lining up. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to undo the one bolt we have left on the fuel block and try to reposition it just slightly, because at this point we're going to damage stuff. If this bolt breaks, I don't know what we're going to do next, but that's the next attempt here. Don't force this too much. So fortunately, the bolt that we had torqued down did not break when I came to loosen it. It was very iffy when I did start loosening it. Now that we've got a little bit of play on the fuel block, we're going to do the high pressure pumps again, and I probably recommend you do this anyways. Don't tighten this down fully. Do your high pressure pumps first, just so you can get all your fittings in. It's kind of like a balance act, okay? If this is all in the perfect straight position, then you'll be able to get those in with a bit of force. See, now they're going in nicely. But I just have left this a bit loose so that I can get these in a bit more easily, and I'll do the other high pressure pump, then I'm going to go back and hand tighten that one this time. And I'm a bit more happy now that it's just going to be hand tight and it's not at that incredibly high foot-pounds that the repair manual had said. The other thing is, with these repair manuals, like I said, these bolts are all different materials and metal mixes all over the motor for cost saving and whatnot. And these are written by engineers when these cars are new. When these cars become old, everything changes. That 18 foot-pounds cannot apply to that heat cycled, opened 100 times, salt, and different forces that have gone through that cheap metal mix of bolt that was in here. So honestly, hand tight, come back after 150 kilometers, even less, and just check everything again, except the intake manifold bolts. They're low torque. Just do those the first time. Everything else on this job, hand tight. Another tip for reinstalling the high pressure pumps, just to avoid bolts falling and getting loose, is take the 3 bolts out, put them in your pocket, because the high pressure pump has a sealing ring and you want to be careful not to damage that. Get the high pressure pump on, and then one by one take out the screws. Just take 2 out at the beginning. 1, 2, thread them back and forth until you can get the high pressure pump to seat, because sometimes where it was sitting on the last time when you took it out, it might want to be continuously jump out. So do 2, snug them, go back and forth between all 3 gently, and then give them their final hand tight and do up the banjo bolts. If you loosen the fuel block at this point to fit your high pressure pumps more easily, retighten that bolt. The other thing, if you have a very odd event, usually the threaded piece that goes into the high pressure pump, you don't touch that with your wrenches. You only touch the part that is associated with the fuel line. But for example, on mine, when I came to reinstall, I saw that one of the fittings that is actually part of the high pressure fuel pump was loose. So I had to tighten that back down as well. So keep an eye on those if those are loose. The one that was loose on mine was the fitting that is associated with the smaller fuel line. The one with the larger fuel line, if by some freak event yours is loose, you will have to make sure that they're threaded the same amount from the actual high pressure pump to the hex part that you could put a wrench on. Because that one, whether it has a stopper inside, I haven't taken apart the high pressure fuel pump to know if it stops at the right amount of threads, but it is not a full flush fit with the hex finish here on the larger fuel line. So if that one gets loose, either match it up with the other one, or you're going to have to do some research and find out how many threads out it's supposed to be. It's possible that it has a stopper, so if you take it out, if you have that problem, then you may be able to just reinstall it and hand tighten it, and it will sit in the right position. So those are just more things to mention for possible, very rare instances with your high pressure fuel pumps upon reinstall. Plug gray connector back into fuel distributing block. Put back 90-degree elbow that goes on PCV box. Bring the evap purge valve over, put it back on its tab, connect it to its respective hoses, and plug in its electrical connector. Another point I want to mention is that the broken bolt from the fuel block distributor here is definitely something that we will sort out at some point, but the 3 bolts from the high pressure fuel pumps and the connections here and all the other connections down there are enough to keep this stable enough. So that's also something I wanted to mention. Let's backtrack for a second here. So I plugged in the 90-degree arm, that's fine. The evap purge valve we're going to leave for an even later stage at this point, because this line here is going to be in our way when we come to put the throttle body and other things in this area. So leave this up here. Evap purge valve we'll come back to later. Put throttle body back in its position. Tighten the bolts, hand tight, and plug in the connector for the throttle body. As you're doing this process, you're then going to put the flex pipe back, tighten the hose clamps, and reconnect this vacuum line to the fitting on the back of the flex pipe. Another notable mention here, which might save some of you headache. I can't remember if this was a one-time use clamp or if it wasn't, but now that I'm reinstalling, I remember that I did buy a new clamp for this hose to put it onto the flex tube here. So when you're buying clamps for the coolant bypass on the intake manifold, buy 1 or 2 extra ones. They cost next to nothing. And just have one in case, so that when you get here, if this was a one-time use clamp, you have something else. So this is a clamp that I replaced. This is not original to the car. This fitting here is a delicate one, okay? When you come to push this vacuum line into it, it's on a flex tube. So it's going to have points where it can possibly tear or break. So you want to hold the back of the 90-degree arm and gently wiggle the vacuum line on, and then get your hose clamp on. It has a bump stop. You want to make sure that the vacuum line is all the way into the bump stop before you tighten down the clamp in order to avoid vacuum leaks. So be very gentle with this one back here. Next, we're going to put on the low pressure fuel line. Then we're going to get the PCV breather hose contraption and plug it into both banks and plug it into the PCV box. Remember the 110mm nut that joins that breather tube onto the throttle body. reinstall the evap purge valve onto its bracket and plug in the electrical connectors and the hoses. When reinstalling the evap purge valve, there is an arrow on the body of the purge valve showing the directionality of it. It's pretty hard to mix up because the electrical connector is at the back, but it does happen sometimes, so just mind the arrow on top of the purge valve. In the case that you've done the coolant bypass, this puts a little bit more forward motion on the evap purge line. So your evap purge line might sit a little bit sideways. It's nothing drastic, but you might have to shimmy it in there a little bit. It's just borderline enough that it's not pressuring anything, but if your evap purge valve is not sitting perfectly straight on the tab, don't keep trying to force it. It's most likely not going to go down because of the coolant bypass line. Next, we are going to replace the front engine cover bracket with its 10mm bolts. Then we're going to reinstall the rear engine cover bracket with its 2 bolts. They're 2 different sizes. They're all 10mm. After that, we'll put the carbon engine covers on and plug in the 1 plastic tab connector that goes in here. Once you put this on, it'll be obvious which one that is. It just clicks in. We used needle nose pliers in part 1 to take it out. After you've got the front engine bracket in, before you put the engine covers on, keep the 2 zip ties that you cut off in part 1, just so you can reference them for the right size. And you're going to get 2 new zip ties and zip tie the wiring bundle with 2 zip ties onto the front engine cover bracket. Everything's back together on the car. Unfortunately, we won't be doing a first start video as this car still has a fuel delivery issue that we need to sort out, and the car's been turned on one too many times with that issue. So once we get that figured out and fixed, there will be a video on that coming up. Then we'll give the car a start. The fuel delivery issue video, you can go and see that. That's on the channel too. I'd been advised by a few people that are knowledgeable about these cars that it could be a low pressure fuel pump. Doing more research has shown me that the one-way check valve is actually inside of the fuel filter. So we're going to do that as a next step before we start this car, but it could still be the low pressure fuel pump. On a final note for this project, I just want to say that if you've been wrenching on cars for a while, this is something you should attempt to do. If you're a junior wrencher and you've only worked on maybe a Honda or a Corolla before in your life, not that there aren't very difficult jobs on those cars. People don't give those cars enough credit for some of the more difficult jobs that they do have. But if you are not completely comfortable with your wrenching skills, even the simplest tasks on this car, which you would think are very simple, are places where you can start dropping bolts, things that you would never think of. A lot of tasks on this car are going to be very strenuous on your attention if you don't have a lot of experience wrenching. So although this is doable by anyone with this tutorial that I've put together, I still don't recommend you do this if you don't have a comfortable amount of experience wrenching on German cars.